Brian, in trying to understand what God is all about, we typically talk about God's omnipotence, omniscience, benevolence, etc. One of the areas that seems more difficult is God's freedom, that God is fully free. What does that mean, and why are there some problems with God's freedom?
Well, we ordinarily understand freedom as having options, having choices, being able to do one thing or another. And there have been arguments that God really doesn't have options or choices. And the basic thought, I think, is that his goodness kind of limits and his rationality kind of limits what his options would be. For example, suppose that there really is a best thing God can bring about. Well, if you're perfectly good, surely you want the best. And if you've got perfect rationality, you see what the best is, you understand that it's the best. And if you've got the power to do it, then you just do the best. And so, bang, if you're God, you're stuck with the best, so to speak. You're kind of a slave to it. Where there's an objective best, it seems like God would be, so to speak, forced to that by his nature. And where there's not an objective best, it seems like he would have no reason to go one way or the other. He'd just sort of have to make a blind, random choice almost. So the question is, does God have any options? Are they significant options? And how does he make up his mind if he does have options?
Yeah, those sound like significant problems. So how do you begin to address them?
Okay. One broad picture of God sort of sees him as this perfectly rational cosmic computer of objective value. And that's the picture I sort of use to pose the problem. God just sees what all the values are, and where there's a best, bang, he just outputs that as the answer. That's what the choice is. And where he sees that there's no objectively best answer, well, then there's just no difference as far as he's concerned. He just kind of picks one at random.
It's very robotic. It's very computational.
Yes, yes. And it's an uncomfortable sort of picture because, well, for one thing, it makes us sort of the winners of a lucky divine lottery. Consider God could have had Leftow and you, or he could have had Leftow and Schloon, who would have been just like us, but just a little bit better. Or he could have had Leftow +1 and Schloon +1. For every creature, there could be a slightly better one. And if there's no best, God would have no best guided reason to pick one creature rather than the other. So what would he do? Well, on this picture, he just kind of draws a card. And well, what do you know? We came out. And do you really want to think that God had no better reason for making you than just, well, I drew the card. Okay, I'll make him. So that's not a picture of God that I find congenial. It's also one, paradoxically, that makes him less rational than he might be, because after all, he's just kind of picking blind wherever he hasn't got a best to go by. A second picture of God would say, well, when there's no best, and maybe even when there is a best, he's got personal preferences, and those guide him. He's got likes, dislikes, loves, more of a personality, passions, and those can also guide his choices.
So some would seem to think that what you're doing is diminishing God to like a superhuman person, but investing God with human-like qualities.
If you're going to say anything positive about God at all, you're going to make him somewhat human-like. I mean, even if you just say that God exists, well, that's something he's got in common with us. If you say God's got a mind, that's something he's got in common with us. So if you can know anything positive about God at all, you're going to say some things about him that make him like us. The question is, what are the ways he's like us? Many people would say that it's a good thing about human beings that we love, that this is not a bad or a limiting thing. It's not like saying that we're fickle or that we're jealous, or it's not one of the imperfections about being human that we love. So when I talked about God having passions, about God having preferences, that might have sounded very human and anthropomorphic, but so let me rephrase that. Let's say, what I want to say is that God has loves. Having loves is a perfection. It's a good thing. If we could know that God loved, that would be a good thing to know about God.
So are you saying that God's love can enhance God's freedom by challenging or contradicting God's rationality?
It does enhance his freedom, but I think it also enhances his rationality, oddly enough. First, the point about freedom. If God can have loves, then he can, so to speak, be free from the domination of the best. Suppose, just for the sake of argument, that there was a best creature God could possibly make, a super archangel. If God was bound to the best, he'd have to make that sort of thing.
Over and over again.
Yeah. Or at least he'd have to make sure he made at least some of those. But if he's not, suppose that there is a best creature like that, but suppose also that's not what he loves. What he loves is things like you and me. That's what he really like the idea. If he can follow his loves, he can make us instead, or us in addition. Whereas if he was just bound to the best, that would be all he had reason to do.
Yeah, I guess it depends what you mean by best, because best can be some sort of a formalized best that is perfect in its design, but things that look like perfect art may be ugly because it's so symmetrical or something. It doesn't have any originality and character. It doesn't move and do things. So it's what we define as best. Isn't that an odd thing? How do you define best?
Okay, that's a worthwhile issue, but it's sort of at right angles to this. In a sense, I'm putting that aside and I'm saying, well, let's just suppose you can define
whatever it is.
Whatever it is.
Okay.
And then what I'm saying is, whatever it is, God's love would enable him to choose something else instead or in addition, whereas otherwise he wouldn't have a basis for doing so. Okay. Now, the odd thing is that also makes him a more rational being, if that's the way God works. And the reason's this. In the God just objective value computer robot mold,
right,
if he hasn't got a best to go with, well, then he's got really no reason to do one thing rather than another, and he just picks randomly. But suppose that God loves. Well, then he might pick the best. But he also finds himself loving something, and that you love something is a reason to make it or to choose it or to do it. So his love gives him reasons to act, and having reasons to act on enables you to act more rationally.
With a larger definition of rationality, because it's not a robotic rationality. What you're doing is you're putting into the rationality the concept of God's loves. And it's really a weighting factor. How much do you weight different factors in creating this? And what you're saying is that God's loves, which is God's preferences, God's feelings, God's personality, is embedded within the choice process.
That's right. That's right. It's not just a robotic registering of the best. There are reasons provided by his desires, his loves, just as, I'm going to sound anthropomorphic, but just as it is with us too. I mean, part of the reason we do things is because we see that they're best. Part of the reason we do things is that we see that they're what we like. And they're both genuinely reasons. They're things the reason takes account of when we make choices.
How does God have loves and likes and personality? By what mechanisms is this something God always had? Have they changed? They're always the same? When I have preferences, they're different things. The things change over time. Has God had these preferences from eternity and never change? Those are preferences that never change get ossified.
Okay. If God knows everything from all eternity, then everything he could base a preference on is there for him. The only way his preferences could change then is if his personality changed at some more basic level. But if he's already a perfect being by nature, then it seems like he's already got a perfect personality set.
So you're embedding within a perfect being a personality, and that personality has to be static because everything was perfect from the beginning, so it can't get better or it can't even change.
If there was anything about God's preferences that he saw he would have a reason to change, he would have changed it already, because he would have known that there was a reason to change it from all eternity.
Or there could have been circumstances change.
But he would have known the circumstances.
Oh, right, okay.
I mean, when you start out with perfect knowledge.
And when you have a timeless, eternal God.
We haven't even really gotten to that.
Yeah, right.
We've just said, okay, even if he was in time,
right,
still from all eternity, from all the way back, he would have had all this knowledge. And that would have meant that he'd already gotten his preferences into the best shape he could have gotten them into.
Let me ask you this question about God's freedom. Is it the case, I can do good things and I can do bad things? I try to do good things. I hope, our conversation's a good thing, but, I can do bad things too. God doesn't do bad things, but is it the case that it is impossible for God to do bad things, almost logically impossible? Or is it the case that God could do bad things because God's free, but chooses and never to do bad things?
The big question about God's freedom is how much his goodness limits his range of choices. And you've really posed one of the fundamental issues about that. Does his goodness so constrain his choices that he can't choose to do an overall evil act? I'm inclined to say that yes, it does constrain him that way, that God is perfectly good by nature, and so his nature rules out doing bad.
Still, that's not getting to the deepest level, because by nature he won't do it. But if God thinks in a simulated way, just to test his own powers and his own freedom, well, if can I do this, in a simulated way, would that be a logical contradiction in God, so that it would be impossible, like for God to add 2 and 2 and get 5? It's just impossible for God to even imagine doing it.
That's the way I think of it.
So that makes God less free in some sense than you and I.
In one respect, he's got fewer options. I accept that.
Mm-hmm. And to you, that limitation would be part of a perfection, not an imperfection.
Right. When thinking about God as a perfect being, you sort of got to try and balance things off. Here you've got a place where goodness and freedom have to be balanced in a certain way. You can emphasize the freedom, but that would take away from the perfection of his goodness, because it would leave him with a possibility of doing evil. Or you can emphasize the goodness, but if you push that far enough, you're taking away from the perfection of his freedom. You've got to choose one or the other. I think the balance of the arguments is for choosing perfect goodness.
If that's the case, if you're privileging goodness over freedom, which you are, correct?
Yeah.
So if you're privileging goodness over freedom, that seems to elevate the concept of goodness to something above God, to where God has to conform to an absolute standard of goodness.
It's right that God has to conform to an absolute standard of goodness, but it doesn't follow that the standard is above God. I think a better way to look at it would be to say that the standard is set by his own nature, so that in the end what God is conforming to is just his own nature.
That sounds as it could be circular reasoning, and so help me understand why that's not circular reasoning.
Okay, why does it sound circular? Could you flesh it out a little?
Yeah, because you're saying that the goodness is sort of part of God from the beginning, and yet God has to conform to this kind of goodness. It sounds like it's a little bit of a trick to get God to conform to some higher good, but the higher good is coming from God's self. It's like saying, does God create himself in some way?
It's not that God creates himself, but that for God the fundamental obligation is to be what he is. We say that about people. Be what you are. That's what being a good person is for God. It's being what he is. So we've all got our own basic natures. For us, to thine own self be true isn't necessarily good advice, because sometimes we should be true to something better than ourselves. Right. But for God, it's perfect advice.